In Washington, a single late-night social media post has ignited fears across immigrant communities and jolted America's business leaders. President Donald Trump is promising a permanent pause on migration from poorer nations, a reversal of a centuries-old identity and a blow to an economy built on newcomers. Across the Atlantic, Britain, long the cheerleader of market dynamism, is now stuck in a cycle of stagnation. A new budget meant to rebuild confidence has instead deepened doubts about whether political courage still exists in London. Tonight, borders and budgets, nationalism and decline. What happens when powerful nations retreat, not expand? Let's find out. I'm Henny Saif. Let's get in focus. Immigration has always been at the heart of America's identity and its economy. Yet President Trump now suggests that only a forced reversal of decades of migration can cure crime and insecurity. This rhetoric comes after the tragic National Guard shooting near the White House, even though academic research repeatedly shows immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than US-born citizens. Economists warn the consequences could be severe. Over 31 million US jobs rely on foreign-born workers. And analysts say deportation crackdowns already put pressure on key sectors from construction to healthcare. Yet Trump frames immigration as a national security issue, expanding screening lists and threatening entire communities with removal. His message? You won't be here for long. A political message ahead of an election year, or a fundamental rewrite of American identity and labor power. We're joined now by Professor David K. Johnston, the Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist and professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and one of the most well-versed voices on Trump's policy. Professor Johnston, welcome to In Focus. President Trump's post appears more politically angry than politically detailed. What does the timing of it tell us?
Well, I think Donald is trying to exploit the tragedy in Washington, D.C., where an Afghan national who had worked closely with the American military and intelligence community and was then led into the country by the Trump administration, opened fire on two National Guard officers, sort of, we call them weekend soldiers in America, killing one and the other is in critical condition. And I think Donald has seized upon that as an opportunity to push his agenda. Well, the nominal agenda is Make America Great Again. Many of us see it as Make America White Again because it's clearly aimed at people of color and especially Muslims.
Mm-hmm. Well, crime statistics contradict the narrative that he's using.
Yes.
Why do these claims still resonate with his base?
Well, because his base are basically the poorly educated. And indeed, at every rally, Trump always says, we love the poorly educated. These are people who don't have critical thinking skills. In America, the most recent data shows more than half of adults read below the level of an 11-year-old, at or below the level of an 11-year-old child, and more than 1 in 5 Americans reads at the level of a 7-year-old, which means they're functionally illiterate. So these are people who don't have the knowledge and thinking skills to critically understand even rudimentary public policy. Donald comes along and says, I can explain why your economics are terrible, something I wrote 3 best-selling books about, by the way. And it's because of those brown-skinned people, those murderers and rapists from Mexico, those Muslims, those Hindus. They're taking your jobs. and not knowing how to learn the actual facts, it resonates with these folks.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've seen the immigration problems and deportations throughout the year in the U.S. Now, deportations and labor shortages, could the U.S. economy actually suffer more than it gains as a result of this presidential decision? I mean, being a businessman himself, does he not realize that entire industries and sectors rely on immigrants?
Yes, and indeed, Donald has exploited immigrants. His first major project used 400 uh, people from Poland who were illegally in the United States, and he refused to pay them because they had nowhere to go, being illegal, to challenge him until they threatened to murder his overseer. And when they did get paid, there was a mafia figure who sat at the end of the table and took part of the pay of each of those workers. Donald has a long history of exploiting laws on immigrant workers in America. The American economy is highly dependent upon people from the rest of the world. Trump doesn't understand that. More than half the economic growth in America since 1948 is a direct result of taxpayer investments in basic science. Trump is busy cutting and canceling basic science research grants. And all of this goes to something that I've written about Donald over the 37 years that I've known him and studied him. He is appallingly ignorant of the world, and he has long made statements and been found after formal judicial proceedings to have engaged in racist and discriminatory conduct.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're actually talking about the identity of the United States that has been built on foreign hands, by foreign hands. Now, is the White House shifting from the broader enforcement to an ideological fight over who deserves to be an American?
Oh, I think that's an underlying message. Donald has asserted that he has the right under the American Constitution to remove American citizens, natural born citizens, whom he doesn't dislike. He is trying to get the Supreme Court to change the Constitution so that people who are born here do not have birthright citizenship. Not all countries have that, but the U.S. has since the 14th Amendment, right after the American Civil War. And Trump has this very mistaken belief that, as he has said, I have an Article 2 of the American Constitution, an Article 2 that says I can do anything that I want. That's not at all true. And I teach law. This is something I make sure all of my students understand. That's not at all what the Constitution says. The problem, as a practical matter, is that Trump has so cowed and intimidated his own party that very few Republicans will stand up to him, because in a primary election, that's where a party picks who it's running in the general election, he will run someone against you if you don't bow to his every demand. We've seen several people leave Congress over this. We'll have a big test of this next week in Tennessee, where there's a special election to fill an empty congressional seat. But Trump has been masterful at this in terms of intimidating and controlling people. And it's part of the tactics he's used throughout his career to bully, intimidate, extort people, which I've documented in 3 books and thousands of articles and columns.
Professor Johnson, now, Afghan allies who fought alongside U.S. troops, risked their lives, their families' lives, are now targets. So what is the signal to future global partners and allies?
Yeah, that we should certainly hope that the United States does not find itself in a situation where we need the support of locals, whether they're the Filipinos in World War II or Afghans who were willing to risk their lives to oppose the Taliban in Afghanistan. This is an absolutely horrible long-term strategy that will be very expensive. And Trump has suggested, he hasn't said this flat out, but he has suggested that because of this one incident, all the Afghans who worked with our military were vetted by his administration and or Biden's and are in the U.S. should be removed and sent back, which for many of them would be a death sentence.
Well, from a political point of view, is this strategy strengthening Trump's position, his party, or is it risking a backlash from from businesses and moderates?
Well, earlier this month, in elections across the country, off-year elections, there was an absolute shellacking of Republicans. The Democrats romped like they haven't in many years. And we'll have another test of this next Tuesday. But Trump's poll numbers, he keeps saying, I have the highest poll ratings in history. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. Absolute nonsense. He's at the lowest rating for any modern American president this far into his either first term or, in his case, second term. And his numbers are declining. And his tariffs, which are a key factor in inflation, the loss of 1 million jobs so far this year, where people were laid off or fired, those are not helping him. What he's trying to do is cover that up. The federal agency that gathers statistics on employment, economic growth, its reports are not being issued. That's never happened before in the history of the United States. But if the numbers are not going to be numbers Donald wants, he's going to suppress them. This is not sitting well with top business leaders who need the data for their staffs to plan for whether they're going to invest or back off. And it's not going to sit well with workers. He keeps saying that, prices are down. The prices are not down anywhere. They're up tremendously. But he believes he can just persuade people. If he says something, it's true. You should believe what he says is true. And if you don't, well, you must be fake news.
Mm-hmm. Well, then how might this reverse migration policy reshape the U.S. socially, economically, and geopolitically, if even partially implemented?
Well, isolating the United States from the rest of the world will have very serious long-term economic, cultural, and geopolitical consequences. The U.S. Runs the best research universities in the world. I teach at one of them. And the number of foreign students who are here, many of whom seek to stay afterwards, is down sharply. There's a great deal of intimidation of students, especially if they are Muslim and or of color. And so this is long-term very bad for the American economy. However, assuming Trump does not fully impose his dictatorship, we have the opportunity in 2028 to elect someone else to office and undo his policies, especially if next year the Republicans lose control of the House and the upper chamber, the Senate.
Mm-hmm. Professor Johnston, what sort of reaction does President Trump or his administration expect from the poorer nation, the third world countries that are on that list of trying to permanently stop any sort of immigration to the U.S.?
They don't care. I mean, that's the single most important thing. Remember that Trump in his first term referred to Africa as a whole as a continent of, in polite language, outhouse nations. They don't care. That's the important part. These people are not steeped in world affairs. They don't have any understanding of history. The notion that Egyptian society under the Pharaonic era lasted over 3,000 years, or that 500 years ago, the two richest nations in the world were China and India, these are unknown to Trump. He claims he solved 8 wars, several of which don't exist. They involve countries that are hundreds or thousands of miles apart, because he lives in this make-believe fictional world in his head, something that I and many other people since I started doing this back in the late 80s have documented, where he just makes things up and expects you to believe them. And unfortunately, a lot of the American press quotes him without checking the facts and showing that what he's saying many times is not true. The Washington Post in his first term documented more than 30,000 misleading statements and outright lies.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know him very well, Professor Johnston. Do you think he will follow through with this decision?
As he will go as far as the courts allow him to go. There will absolutely be actions filed in federal court to try and block him. He has been relying on the Supreme Court for help. District courts and courts of appeal have, by a ratio of about 96%, gone against Trump and said, you're doing things that are illegal or unconstitutional or otherwise not allowed. But the US Supreme Court has been using a backdoor technique called the shadow docket to say, well, we're going to let the litigation continue, but in the meantime, the president can do what the lower courts say is improper or illegal or unconstitutional. That's been his lever to continue his policies to remove people from the country, including apparently more than 100 American citizens.
Mm-hmm. Professor David K. Johnston, thank you very much, sir, for your insight and helping us unpack the stakes behind his historic shift in U.S. identity. Now, from America's shifting identity to Britain's eroding stability, powerful nations seem more uncertain about the future than ever. Britain is drifting into a dangerous moment. Stagnant productivity, rising debt, and a political centre hollowed out by extremes. The Reform Party and Greens now outpoll both Labour and the Conservatives combined. This week's budget was meant to restore stability. Instead, economists call it a bodged job. More borrowing, delayed reforms, cautious policy where bold action is needed. Rachel Reeves promised prudence, but she delivered backloaded consolidation, shrinking ambition, and more pressure on workers and investment. The risk? Neither markets nor voters may wait for 2029. Britain has advantages: a young population, early adoption of AI, and global financial firepower. But high housing and energy costs and Brexit's shadow continue to suffocate growth. Once a pioneer of global economic reform, Britain now fears its own decline. And we're joined by Mr. Babak Imamian, the economist and political analyst, with a clear lens on both London's political battles and the structural weaknesses driving Britain's economic anxiety. Mr. Imamian, why is Britain still refusing to confront the structural reforms experts say are essential?
Thank you very much for your question, and this is a very interesting topic. Why there is this decline in our political system? Well, if you look at it, this liberal democracy, it's a 100 years experiment. It really started the mass politics of democracy started taking foothold in 1920. And in the last 105 years, if you notice, at every cycle of election, it has produced weaker governments. Except during the World War II, which was not on during Winston Churchill's time. He was appointed rather than being elected as a prime minister. Had there been an election in 1940, perhaps he would not have been the British prime minister. Lord Halifax might have been, or somebody else. So what I'm trying to say is, if you look at every cycle, we've had weaker and weaker governance, especially in recent time. There was a period where Margaret Thatcher was a very strong leader, which now we look at it as an exception. Tony Blair government and Gordon Brown as a chancellor almost followed her policy. So what I'm trying to say is this mass politics is leading to weaker government. And the reason is because democracy inherently goes for the averages. It doesn't go for meritocracy. So every time, every cycle, the average goes lower. So if you look at it, by this time, 2024, we had a very low average. We've seen it with Rachel Reeves yesterday as the chancellor, the crying chancellor, I should say, and a very unpopular prime minister, Keir Starmer. So if we just take that, the 2029 would even produce a weaker government. And by 2034, within 9 to 10 years, the system would not collapse, but the parliament would end up more like a town hall than actually a parliament of a great nation. And I would explore that later on with you, why we are getting to this.
Yes, well, what about the market confidence? Will the delayed fiscal tightening damage the market confidence, or is London betting the world won't notice?
Well, very interesting. You use the word market. Market, by definition, mostly we mean the bond market, the market that lends money to governments. And that's what they care about. The governments, they only care about bond market because that's where they go to get their money. Obviously, the bond market was very happy on Wednesday because they saw a government that is prepared to tax its people to pay them. And all the bond market wants is to get paid for what they lend. And the Labour government is an ideal client because they don't know how to grow the economy. So next year, they would need another 20, 30, 50 billion to borrow. So they would go for more. And the bond market is prepared to lend them money because they are good clients. They pay on time. They are prepared to tax their people and pay them. So the reaction from the bond market has been very positive to this Labour government because this Labour government, its priority is not to grow the economy, even though Rachel Reeves yesterday said she will not come back next year for more money because she's going to grow the economy. But the question is, why hasn't she grown the economy for the last 18 months or so? So that's what I'm trying to make. The bond market likes them, but the average person or the wealth makers, they don't like Rachel Reeves or the Labour government.
Mm-hmm. So if the Labour Party is not growing the economy, are they just simply managing the decline then?
The reason, if we go back, because we have weak leadership. And the weak leadership is because of the political system we have, that instead of having political leaders, we have, in form of our MPs, community leaders. Now, how did we get to have community leaders rather than political leaders? Because we have diluted our class system. Now, the British class system, for all its fault, it was a great system because it preserved the country. Also, it protected the political system from excesses of masses. And we've seen that, like welfare system. 100 years ago, the whole welfare system was based only to protect the realm of the country, the defense of the country, and law and order. Now it's become something like 40% of government revenue, of free housing, free education, free healthcare, with no accountability. And it has distorted this free supply of everything, has distorted the relationship between demand and supply, because when it is free supply, you don't know how much demand there is, real demand. It's like offering food to everybody. You don't know if everybody wants, how hungry people or how much they are prepared to eat. So you just prepare the food and most of it would go to waste, or people would eat more than they need to eat, or something would go wrong. So when you distort that relationship between demand and supply in any form, you distort the market, and it only leads to corruption, and it would lead to wastage. And that's what we've had for the last 105 years.
Yes, well, also the housing and energy reforms have stalled. What is the real political fear driving this hesitation? Are they fearing a public backlash as the one the UK witnessed during the times of Margaret Thatcher, for instance?
Well, on housing is the most important part of the infrastructure is housing. And the best way to stimulate housing is to allow people to buy their own houses. But since 2008, lending has been restricted. So average person finds it very difficult to buy a property by borrowing. Only people who have large deposit or a very good income, they can buy houses. And this, so less money has gone into construction of housing. So there is less supply of housing. And there is, and instead of making lending easier, they have formed a layer of government called Financial Conduct Authority, which has over-regulated the lending to the individuals, especially on the housing, and has destroyed the housing. Also, Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, it's a backdoor to exchange control. So any sort of money coming into UK, it has to be overchecked. Even it's coming from very reputable banks, they have to be over-regulated, so on and so. So it has stopped people actually sending money or bringing money into UK. And this was a layer of government for the friends and family of those who are in charge, very much a socialist system. And if you go back to OBR, Office of Budget Responsibility, another layer of government with lots of economists who none of them have been in private sector, telling government how much money they can spend. And this is ridiculous. So previous to these two layers of government before 2010, we had the Treasury and Bank of England. Now we have 4 layers of government, and none of them know what they are doing. None of them take responsibility, and none of them make any decisions. So I don't know what you want to call it, but I would call it a failure of our political system.
Mm-hmm. Well, trying to find all the sort of reasons for this economic stagnation, do you feel that Brexit has also permanently limited Britain's growth capacity? Do you think, and if so, do you think any leader would admit it?
This level of conversation that I am having with you, you would hardly find it in any political debate nowadays in United Kingdom, because the MPs are not, they would not discuss these things, even if you question them or you open up conversation with them. Again, why? Because they come from a much lower level of intellectualism. They are excellent in terms of community representation, to deal with the roadworks, to deal with the trees on the streets, to do with refuge collections, and so on and so. But when it comes actually how to grow the economy or how to improve the community in terms of wealth generation, they have no idea. They are very good in terms of, as I said, taking care of potholes in the roads or the trees or refuge collection. But even when it comes to law and order, because there is that lack of financing, which the government did not bother to actually increase the funding for law and order. We have a major crime issue. And as President Trump said, crime is the first thing. Mm-hmm. If you don't address it, then regardless of how good economic plan you have, it becomes useful. Nobody would come. But this was not addressed on Wednesday. So going back to your question, the level of discussion, unfortunately, when it comes to our political system, is very low. Outside of it, it's not bad. And I have also to say the media follows the politicians more than those who actually want to raise the level of conversation. So even the mainstream medias are lowering the level of conversation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do know how you feel about Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, but what must Britain do now to avoid a financial shock or a political earthquake?
We need a strong leader, somebody who actually understands the dynamic of money and knows how it works and prepared to take tough decisions and is not bothered about public opinions, but he has a vision. He or she has a vision to take us through these revolution. We need a revolution in our system. And I go back again, before we had a class system where the whole democracy was based on that, where not everyone could get to the position of power at random. Right now, our political system had become so random. Anyone from anywhere, if you look at it, whether the leader of the Green Party or our far-right parties, they could be our next prime ministers. Now, this would not have happened 100 years ago or 80 years ago, even 60 years ago. But now it's a possibility that we have people with fringe policies becoming the next prime minister.
Mm-hmm. From London, that was Mr. Babak Imamian. Mr. Imamian, thank you very much for your insights and analysis of a budget that could shape or shake Britain's future. Now, America and Britain, two nations that once defined global ambition, now caught between fear democracy still have the will to build or only the fear to block? I'm Henny Saif. Thank you for being with us.